While champagne was being sipped in Paris, the French infantryman was being turned into a sitting duck, handed a rifle that would jam from a mere sideways glance. We are used to blaming the 1940 catastrophe on incompetent generals, but look at the actual weapons of the soldiers. The French army, dubbed the best in Europe, turned out to be an antique museum. This was not the arsenal of a superpower, but a junkyard of worn-out scrap, scraped together just to fill reports. While the Wehrmacht underwent unification, the French soldier carried the burden of the country's industrial impotence. Instead of modern systems, soldiers were issued iron from the days of Verdun. The metal was so fatigued that mechanisms snapped under standard loads. Soldiers read newspaper articles about rearmament, but in reality they received fire pokers that were dangerous to the owner himself. This was a deliberate deception. The government fed the people an illusion of might while sending hundreds of thousands of young men into the trenches with tools that failed the second the fighting started. France entered the war with a rusty sword that crumbled in its hands. But rusty barrels were only half the trouble. The true nightmare began when the ammunition crates were opened. This was a severe miscalculation by engineers who failed to do things properly and unify calibers in time. Ordinary soldiers had to pay for their laziness and incompetence with their lives right in the trenches. Instead of a single standard, the French army received a logistical hell. 8mm, 7.65mm, and 7.5mm cartridges were used simultaneously within units. While the Germans operated with a refined supply system, French logisticians in the rear turned into gamblers trying to guess which type of ammunition a specific regiment needed. A single division could encounter 3 different standards requiring different supply chains. At the front lines, this mess turned into a catastrophe. In the heat of battle, as German infantry attacked, troops would pry open long-awaited crates only to find that the cartridges simply wouldn't fit into the chambers. Receiving the wrong caliber meant a unit was transformed into a crowd of unarmed targets. Over decades of peace, the ministries failed to agree on a single bullet, condemning soldiers to death over a difference of millimeters. The army choked on a lack of uniformity that staff officers called a transition period, though in reality it was a deadly leapfrog that paralyzed the country's defense. But behind this numerical chaos stood a specific detail, a small protrusion on an old bullet that literally blew up the rifle mechanisms. One extra detail on the casing, the protruding rim, made the French rifle the most temperamental in the world. The root of the infantry's problems lay in the cartridge for the Liebel rifle. The designers left a massive protruding flange on the casing, which became a technical death sentence. Because of this skirt, cartridges in the magazine snagged on one another, creating fatal jams. While the world was transitioning to rimless casings, the French were fighting with ammunition whose shape was better suited for a hunting shotgun. For the soldier of 1940, this turned into hell. While the enemy showered their positions with lead, the Frenchmen frantically picked at the bolt, trying to extract a casing that had canted in the mechanism. The rifle's magazine became a lottery. Would it feed around or bite into the metal for good? Heroic defense was shattered by primitive geometry. Engineering stubbornness cost France its mobility of fire. Fighters spent more time fighting their own weapons than shooting at the enemy. The vaunted Liebel became a symbol of technical backwardness, dragging the army into its grave. In an attempt to fix the disgrace, engineers created a new cartridge, but managed to make it a perfect gift for the enemy. The French M1924 cartridge turned out to be so similar to the German one that the occupiers used captured warehouses as their own. When the French command finally realized the scale of the catastrophe with rimmed cartridges, they decided to create a new standard, 7.5 by 54 millimeters. For 10 years, the country's best minds worked on the ammunition that was supposed to save the army. The result was shocking. In its dimensions and ballistics, the new cartridge almost completely copied the German Mauser. France performed an incredible feat by creating a twin cartridge for its main enemy. This engineering decision became fatal in 1940. German troops, capturing French warehouses, discovered millions of rounds that were perfectly suited for their own needs after minimal adjustment of captured equipment. For years, France accumulated resources and built factories only to end up supplying the advancing Wehrmacht for free. The Germans were gunning down the French army, using its own industrial capacities against its creators. While Paris spent budgets on development, it de facto built a second raw material base for Hitler, turning national security into an act of technical charity for a future executioner. The MAS-36 rifle was fashioned for this cartridge, but seeing it in battle was harder than spotting a ghost. France's most modern rifle was a legend that soldiers only saw in newspapers, while they themselves fought back with fire pokers from 1907. By the mid-30s, France had finally created a worthy weapon, the MAS-36. Short, rugged, and chambered in a modern caliber, it was meant to be the answer to the German Mauser. But this is where total industrial paralysis set in. While the propaganda machine trumpeted the Republic's might, factories were churning out rifles in pathetic batches. Instead of arming the strike units on the border, officials made an absurd mistake. New barrels were sent to rear units, training camps, and colonies to avoid mixing calibers on the front lines. The result was a surreal nightmare in 1940. Elite divisions, taking the brunt of panzer wedges, went into battle with antique Berthier and Label rifles that remembered Napoleon III. Meanwhile, the latest MAS-36 gathered dust in warehouses deep within the country or guarded the sands of the Sahara. Millions of fighters were left without modern protection due to administrative impotence. The soldiers felt betrayed. They knew the country had decent weapons, but in their hands was nothing but rusty junk. But the real technical horror began when France attempted to create its own automatic weapons, a self-loading rifle that could fall apart in the shooter's hands after the very first magazine. While Germany and the USSR were finding their way toward reliable automatic weapons, France decided to surprise the world with the RSCM 1917/18 rifle. It was an attempt to create the weapon of the future, but in reality it was a mechanical nightmare. The design was so overcomplicated and fragile that the iron literally snapped from its own vibration during firing. The gas mechanism, hidden under the handguard, would clog with carbon after a dozen shots, turning the futuristic automatic into a useless piece of metal. For the soldier in the trench, the RSC became a symbol of a death trap. The rifle was extremely sensitive to dirt. The smallest grain of sand in the mechanism led to a fatal jam. The disgrace reached its peak. French soldiers distrusted their high-tech weapons so much that they began breaking off the automatic components en masse. They preferred to turn the semi-automatic into a basic manual stick just to be sure that the next shot would actually happen. The state had issued them a suicide tool disguised as a triumph of engineering thought. The shame reached the point where France began buying weapons from Hitler, acknowledging the death of its own production. Official Paris sponsored Hitler by purchasing submachine guns from him, because they couldn't give birth to anything of their own. By the end of the 1930s, the great power found itself in a humiliating position. French designers spent years churning out blueprints, but failed to launch a single sane submachine gun into mass production. While the Wehrmacht was mastering the modern MP-38, the French army stood with an outstretched hand before the factories of its future executioner. Lacking its own production, Paris began purchasing German Irma EMPs, effectively pouring money into the war machine of the Third Reich. This was the ultimate manifestation of administrative helplessness. French money went toward expanding the factories that a couple of years later would be stamping out weapons for the capture of Paris. Their own designs existed only as single specimens for parades. One step away from war, the army was left without automatic weapons, and the German crutches only highlighted the collapse of the industry. The country signed a confession of its own impotence, sponsoring the enemy for a pathetic attempt to plug the holes in its defense. But it was even worse with machine guns. French soldiers were turned into jugglers of iron combs, loading a machine gun with rigid strips in 1940. This was a technical act of sabotage that cost the lives of entire crews. While the rest of the world had transitioned to flexible machine gun belts or high-capacity drums, the French army stubbornly clung to archaic rigid cassettes, metal strips of 25 to 30 rounds that resembled giant combs. The Hotchkiss machine gun turned firing into a circus act. The loader had to continuously feed these iron pieces into the weapon. The slightest bend in the thin strip, a tiny grain of sand, or a deformed tooth, and the 25-kilogram machine gun instantly turned into useless scrap metal. This was not just technical backwardness, it was a death sentence in the conditions of maneuver warfare. While a crew fumbled with bent cassettes and tried to dig out a jammed cartridge, German machine gunners with their belt-fed systems mowed down the French by the platoon. The cassette system limited the rate of fire and forced soldiers to make unnecessary movements under fire. France voluntarily deprived itself of fire density, turning its machine gunners into hostages of iron combs that failed at the most critical moment of battle. Against this backdrop, the anti-tank crews looked like children with slingshots facing a concrete wall, going up against a tank with a pop gun. French anti-tank rifles were so weak that the Germans mistook their hits for stones hitting the hull. In 1940, French anti-tank crews resembled suicide squads armed with gardening tools. While German panzer wedges were thickening their armor, France deployed anti-tank rifles and guns against them that had been obsolete for a decade. Soldiers were issued tubes that, upon hitting a target, barely scratched the paint on the panzer's armor. This wasn't a defense, it was a pure imitation of weaponry, existing only to check a box in staff reports. Men were literally sent to the slaughter. French crews, showing miraculous bravery, would allow tanks to get within point-blank range, fire direct hits, and watch in horror as their shells ricocheted without causing any damage. German tank crews later recalled that sometimes they didn't even realize they were under fire. The sounds of hits from French firecrackers felt like being pelted with small gravel. The command knew these anti-tank rifles were ineffective, yet they continued to drive young men to the front lines, plugging strategic holes with living bodies. It was a technical genocide of their own people under the guise of military duty. When the front collapsed, de Gaulle's first order was to throw every piece of French weaponry into the trash. France only returned to the war once it had completely rid itself of French bolts and picked up American barrels. When the Vichy government capitulated and the Free France movement began to raise its head, Charles de Gaulle made a difficult but necessary decision. French weapons had to vanish. He de facto acknowledged that national factories had created junk with which victory was fundamentally impossible. The rebirth of the army began not with the restoration of old manufactories, but with a total rearmament using American models. To become a formidable force again, the French had to completely shed their skin and become a mirror image of the US Army. 70,000 Springfields, Garands, and Thompsons became the French soldiers' ticket to real combat. The pride of a great power was trampled by the necessity of using foreign iron, but it was the only chance to stop being victims. French design bureaus, which for decades had spawned unviable monsters, were sent to the scrap heap of history along with their blueprints. Soldiers traded their temperamental Liebels for reliable American rifles with relief, realizing that now their lives depended on the quality of steel, not the fantasies of Parisian bureaucrats. Even the officers' personal sidearms became a symbol of scarcity and empty promises. The modern MAS 1935 pistol became a legend only because no one ever saw it at the front. French industry achieved a miracle. It created a truly excellent pistol. The MAS 1935 was elegant, accurate, and reliable, but it existed in a parallel reality. While ministries admired the sleek lines of the new weapon, factories merely simulated activity, churning it out in minuscule quantities. The pistol instantly became a scarce souvenir for the top brass, remaining nothing more than a ghost from promotional brochures for the rest of the army. The reality of 1940 was grim. Officers and tank crews went into battle with Model 1892 revolvers. These were black powder anachronisms that looked like museum exhibits in the age of submachine guns. While the enemy utilized rapid-fire Walthers, the French plugged supply holes with 19th century antiques. The magnificent MAS 1935 became a symbol of the entire French military-industrial complex. Beautiful ideas that never reached the front, leaving soldiers alone to face an oncoming future. This entire arsenal is a perfect example of how arrogance and stagnation kill a country from within. France's defeat was programmed on the drafting tables of sabotaging engineers. The weaponry of 1940 was not just a technical miscalculation, it was a benchmark of industrial impotence. France's defeat was no accident. It was forged into the metal, the warped bolts, and the bloated casings years before the first salvos were fired. The country entered the greatest war in history with a rusty sword that snapped at the very first second of serious conflict. Millions of ordinary young men thrown into trenches with non-functional junk paid with their lives for the arrogance of politicians and the laziness of designers. The French arsenal will forever remain in history as a monument to an army that prepared for the previous war while officials believed lying reports. It was the collapse of engineering conscience. When technical progress is replaced by parades and pretty blueprints, the payment is a national catastrophe. Technological stagnation turned one of the world's most powerful nations into a defenseless victim in just 6 weeks. But the most shocking part is which ideas from this disgrace have survived to this day. But more on that next time.